Hello and welcome to a revision session looking at Elizabeth I, GCSE AQA paper from 2018 onwards, and we're looking at Elizabeth I and the difficulties of being a female ruler. Elizabeth faced many problems in her life, some of them rooted from things that happened to her in her early life. For example, her mother was Anne Boleyn, who Henry had divorced Catherine of Aragon to marry, and therefore many Catholics, both in her own country and abroad, including kings of Spain and France, saw her as an illegitimate heir to the throne. They didn't recognise the marriage between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And not only that, but Anne Boleyn herself was executed for treason in 1536. So the question of whether Elizabeth would actually even become queen was always hanging over her. Not only because of her mother, but also during the reigns of her brother Edward VI and also her sister Mary I, she was suspected of plotting against the king or queen, and indeed she spent 5 years in the Tower of London at the end of Mary I's reign. In some ways, this actually made her more lenient towards other members, of, like Mary Queen of Scots, of the royal family, who were suspected of disloyalty and treason later on, because she had been in their shoes. However, she did grow up being taught many languages and skills in music and art and science, which would prepare her for life at a royal court, despite the fact that she was only 3 when her mother was executed. So she did have some things in her young life which prepared her for becoming Queen of England. She also was affected by things like seeing her stepmothers and what happened to them in her decisions about marriage. So, for example, she saw one of her stepmothers die in childbirth, which made her particularly less keen to get married. And she also saw another stepmother, as well as her own mother, being beheaded, which obviously didn't particularly enamour her to the idea of marriage. So once Elizabeth became queen, who actually held the power, and what kind of problems did she face? Was she fully in control? Well, there's 4 key areas that had power. So we had Parliament, the Lord Lieutenants, the Privy Council, and the Justices of the Peace. The Lord Lieutenants did have quite some power. They settled local disputes, and most of them actually also happened to be Privy Councillors who had quite a lot of influence over the Queen and the decisions she was making. But the thing that made them the most powerful was the fact that Elizabeth relied on Lord Lieutenants in every local area to raise an army whenever she required one. There was no standing army. So Lord Lieutenants did actually have quite some power. If they decided to rebel against Elizabeth and she didn't have enough support, then they could potentially overthrow her and replace her with someone else as queen. There were attempts to do this whilst Elizabeth was alive, including Norfolk's rebellion against her in the late 1500s. Parliament, in comparison, had very little actual power. Although they could have influence over taxes that were being collected and whether new ones could be created, Elizabeth could choose whether or not she was actually going to listen to them, and in many cases she banned them from discussing things that she didn't like. For example, she banned their discussion of marriage and the marriage question. So Parliament only really had an advisory capacity other than decisions over taxes. The Lord Lieutenants had greater power because they were the ones who could raise the army. Justices of the Peace were less powerful than both Parliament and Lord Lieutenants, but they were very important for helping Elizabeth to maintain her power. They couldn't raise an army or decide on any laws, but what they were able to do was to enforce laws at a local level. Elizabeth required them to watch out for people breaking the law in the local area, and they had the power to send someone to prison if they broke the law, or if 2 justices of the peace agreed, then someone could be sentenced to death for treason. They, generally speaking, came from the local population or the local area, and they would be members of the local gentry. So not the nobility, those who inherited wealth and titles, but they tended to be wealthy businessmen or people who'd made a fortune through trade. And finally, those who held significant power, the Privy Councillors. Elizabeth relied on the Privy Councillors for the day-to-day running of her country. They were in charge of things like military, foreign affairs, religion, and the Queen's security herself. 2 of the most famous or influential members of the Privy Council were Francis Walsingham, who's also known as the Spy Master, as he set up the first spy network. It was said that he had the eyes and ears everywhere over England, and he was really influential in uncovering plots like the Ridolfi plot against Elizabeth's life. So he held a very important role in keeping Elizabeth safe. William Cecil was also a very influential member of the Privy Council. He was important for different reasons, so mainly he was influential in passing new laws and keeping the country going effectively. For example, he was the one who persuaded Elizabeth to pass the new Poor Laws, to take control over Catholic Ireland, and also to fight her Catholic rivals abroad like France and Spain and the Netherlands. Elizabeth had actually got the power to choose who was on the Privy Council, so even though they had quite some control over the day-to-day running of the country, she chose who was on this particular body or group of people. However, she did really have to choose the most powerful people in England, and tended to be the Lord Lieutenants, because if she didn't, these people might feel that they were going to rebel against Elizabeth and replace her with someone who would give them that power. So in that way, again, the Lord Lieutenants do actually have quite some power in England against Elizabeth. Theoretically, if all the Privy Councillors agreed on something, they could force Elizabeth to do it. However, this was very rare, because most of the time the Privy Councillors all had their own agendas and fought amongst each other about what should actually be done. The marriage question was one of the biggest problems or difficulties that Elizabeth faced as a female ruler. There were many arguments for marriage, including alliances with countries like France and Spain and the Netherlands being possible if she was to marry an heir to the throne or the king himself. There's also the question of having an heir. This was particularly important because if Elizabeth didn't have an heir or a child, then there wasn't a Protestant successor who could take over the throne. The next person in line to take her over was actually Catholic, and she was Mary Queen of Scots. So Parliament in particular really pushed Elizabeth to get married, because they hoped that she would get married and have children, which would secure a Protestant heir to the throne and stop there being any further religious change, which had caused quite a lot of problems over the last 100 years. Elizabeth was particularly worried about this when Mary Queen of Scots tried to marry an important noble, and a Catholic noble in England, the Duke of Norfolk, and we'll see later that this caused a rebellion. There was a particular concern over whether or not Elizabeth should get married after 1562, when she nearly died of smallpox. And Parliament started to discuss it openly in 1566, when they were called to debate and discuss the various issues. Elizabeth was horrified by this, and she felt it was a very personal matter and one that only she should decide upon, so she actually banned Parliament from discussing the marriage question. And it's a show of her power that they actually conformed to this. So only one MP continued to want to discuss or attempt to discuss the marriage question after 1566, and that was Peter Wentworth. And he was arrested almost immediately by Parliament, showing that they were indeed very loyal to Elizabeth. There were three main possible contenders to the throne: King Philip II of Spain, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and Francis, Duke of Anjou. Two of these marriages would have gained foreign alliances, so to Philip II of Spain or Francis, Duke of Anjou with France, and one of these was just a member of the nobility in England. There were problems with all three, and reasons why Elizabeth made the decision to, as she put it, marry her country rather than to get married to an individual. If we start with looking at King Philip II of Spain, although he's really rich, he had South American colonies and lots of gold, he was Catholic, so they would never really agree on religious policy in England. Elizabeth I had seen her sister Mary marry for King Philip II of Spain himself, and they hadn't had an heir, so the possibility of them having an heir was limited anyway. And she'd seen that Spain wasn't particularly interested in the running of England. England would effectively become controlled by Spain and potentially used by Spain in the wrong way. So actually it was quite unpopular with government and with many people in England. And again, she wasn't particularly interested in having a child. She'd seen one of her stepmothers die in childbirth. There was quite a risk there. So she wasn't very interested in marrying King Philip II of Spain. the possibility of marrying Francis, Duke of Anjou, was actually also quite limited. By the time that this marriage possibility was discussed, she was actually 46, so the chances of her having an heir were very limited anyway. And he was also brother to the French king, who was a Catholic, so again, it made it unlikely that they would ever really agree on matters of religion. And given that she was unlikely to have an heir, when she died, the throne would potentially pass to the French, and France would rule over England. So again, that wasn't very popular with government, with Elizabeth, or with many people in the country, so that wasn't really a possibility either. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, in many ways seemed like a very likely solution to the problem of the marriage question. He had been a childhood friend. She felt like she could trust him. He had a lot of influence within government, but even though he was a Privy Councillor and well respected in government, if she married him, that might make other councillors and Privy Councillors jealous. And also, the main reason she couldn't marry him is that his first wife died under very suspicious circumstances, and he was actually suspected of potentially plotting to kill his first wife in order to be able to marry Elizabeth. And there's no way that Elizabeth could be seen to be involved in some sort of plot against someone's life. The main threat that Elizabeth faced as a female ruler was actually rebellion, and that could have been against any ruler, the main threat that they faced, not just simply because she was a female ruler. There were two main culprits, Norfolk, the Duke of Norfolk, and Essex, the Earl of Essex. Norfolk's rebellion mainly happened because the Duke of Norfolk believed that Elizabeth had no right to be the Queen of England, as he was Catholic, and didn't recognise Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII as a legitimate marriage. And he wasn't the only one to have this view. In fact, many people in the north of England agreed with him that Mary, Queen of Scots, the closest or the next in line for the throne, should have inherited the throne rather after Mary I died, and not Elizabeth. Things were made worse when, in 1569, the Duke of Norfolk attempted to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth prevented this marriage from happening. It made the Duke of Norfolk really angry. The main reason that Elizabeth banned this marriage was that both were Catholic, and by marrying Mary, Queen of Scots, there was a possibility that Mary might have a Catholic heir, and that might encourage people to invade from abroad and to potentially put Mary, Queen of Scots on the throne in place of her, because it looked like she had a stronger dynasty than Elizabeth if she had a child, which Elizabeth didn't. So, after Elizabeth blocks the marriage between Mary, Queen of Scots, and the Duke of Norfolk, then that leads Norfolk to leave court without permission. He sort of storms off, and a group of people up in the north see this as a sign that they should rebel against Elizabeth. And 4,600 men amass together to form an army. So this is a particularly significant turning point. It goes from the Duke of Norfolk perhaps not agreeing with Elizabeth and feeling frustrated to the potential to actually overthrow her. And that's a significant number of people. In fact, Elizabeth struggled to gather enough support to put down the rebellion initially, so it was a particularly big threat to her staying on the throne. The rebels took control of Durham Cathedral and celebrated an illegal Catholic mass, which sort of encouraged many other people in the north of England to feel like the Pope and God was on their side, and they started to march down south. Luckily, one of the Lord Lieutenants, the Earl of Sussex, gathered enough support and enough men to detain the rebels, and he started to arrest various rebels, and the rest of them fled to Scotland. And they managed to arrest the Duke of Norfolk and put him in prison in the Tower of London. Unfortunately for Elizabeth, the initial Northern Rebellion wasn't actually the end of Norfolk's plots against her life. In fact, during the 10 years that he was imprisoned in the Tower of London, there's a second plot, the Ridolfi plot, in 1571. This isn't really masterminded by Norfolk, but he's involved in the plot. Roberto Ridolfi was a Catholic banker Being a banker, he was able to travel freely across Europe without too many questions being asked. It was quite normal for people to travel from place to place for trading reasons. So as he travels across Europe and back again, Ridolfi plots with the Pope and other Catholics in the Netherlands to invade England and murder Elizabeth and put her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic, on the throne in her place. Now, given that the Duke of Norfolk had wanted to marry her, he was also involved in the plot in the hope that once Elizabeth had died, he would be able to marry Mary, Queen of Scots. Before this plot was able to be carried out, luckily, it was prevented by the network of spies coordinated by the spy master, Francis of Walsingham, who discovered coded letters about the plot underneath the doormat of Norfolk's house. Before he took the plot any further, Walsingham had the Duke of Norfolk put under an execution order for treason, and he was privately executed for his involvement in this plot on Elizabeth's life. Norfolk's and Ridolfi's plots against Elizabeth were a really significant problem that she faced as a female ruler. Essex's rebellions against Elizabeth were less of a significant threat, but they were a threat against her. Initially, Essex actually was quite in Elizabeth's favour. His father had helped put down Norfolk's rebellion in 1569. Essex himself was one of the Queen's favourites and actually a possible contender for marriage. And Essex has helped defeat the Spanish in 1596 and gained further favour with Elizabeth. So Essex, the Earl of Essex, had actually started off in Elizabeth's favour. He falls out of her favour mainly because of a Privy Council meeting that happens in 1598. Essex had argued with the Queen about something, and when he was arguing with her, he turned his back on the Queen, which was a real insult at the time. And so, in response to that, the Queen hits him round the side of the head, and Essex, in rage, puts his hand on his sword. Now, by putting his hand on his sword, it suggests that he might be going to draw his sword out in a way that men might battle or quarrel at the time. But that potentially also is a traitorous act. So Elizabeth I puts Essex under house arrest until he apologises to her for his inappropriate actions, and he refuses to admit that he did anything wrong. So he remains under house arrest for quite an extended period of time. However, given that he had an extended period of time where he'd been in his favour, eventually Elizabeth takes no further action against him, and they sort of forget about what happened. And it's not until she appoints him Lord Lieutenant of Ireland in 1599, sending him over there to try and deal with a Catholic threat, the sort of rebels that were over in Ireland, that there's another problem. Essex is supposed to defeat the Catholic Irish rebels and then return to England. But what he actually does is he fights a number of battles and he ends up signing a peace truce with the rebels, the Irish Catholic rebels in Ireland, without asking Elizabeth's permission to do this. And he also broke a few rules by knighting some of his army leaders who he felt had done a really good job in the fights without actually gaining victory, which angered Elizabeth as well. So to punish Essex for doing these things, Elizabeth takes away his sweet wine monopoly, which causes him huge debts because most of his money had been coming in from having a monopoly over sweet wines, which means he's the only person allowed to buy and sell it in England. So he has very little left to lose. He's not got favour with Elizabeth anymore, he has hardly any money, so he decides sort of on a whim that he's going to march to London with 200 of his followers. It's not clear whether this was a direct act of rebellion or whether he intended to just sort of show his power in the hope that Elizabeth would give back the sweet wine monopoly. But either way, another Privy Councillor, Robert Cecil, sees what Essex is doing and very quickly states that anyone marching with Essex is a traitor, which carried a death penalty. And therefore most of the rebels very quickly abandon Essex and return to where they had come from. And Essex is arrested along with a few of his followers in private in 1601. Essex's rebellion is much less of a threat than Norfolk's, as it only really involved a smaller group of people, 200 people, alongside Essex, and it happened in England, not involving any other countries. Whereas things like the Ridolfi plot actually involved other countries such as the Netherlands. That's the end of this very quick revision session looking at Elizabeth I and the difficulties she faced being a female ruler. Don't forget to also have a look at some of the revision guides that you've been given, or any of the revision videos which recap question structure, which is also key to getting yourself the best grades. Good luck with your revision.